Hello, listening squirrels. I think I'm good and awake. We'll see how long it lasts. Polly and Tom were talking about when Tom told his dad the news about him being expelled from school. And Polly said, "How did he take your news?" And Tom said, "Like a lamb, for when I'd done, he only said, 'My poor lad, we must bear with one another,' and then told his story." "I'm glad he was kind," began Polly in a soothing tone, but Tom cried out remorsefully, That's what knocks me over. Just when I ought to be a pride and prop to him, I bring him my debts and disgrace, and he never says a word of blame. It's no use. I can't stand it." And Tom's head went down again with something very like a sob that would come in spite of manful efforts to keep it back. For the poor fellow had the warmest heart that ever was, and all the fine waistcoats outside couldn't spoil it. That sound gave Polly more pain than the news of a dozen failures and expulsions, and it was as impossible for her to resist putting her hand tenderly on the bent head as it was for her to help noticing with pleasure how brown the little curls were growing and how soft they were. In spite of her sorrow, she enjoyed that minute very much. Ooh. For she was a born consoler, and it's hardly necessary for me to add, loved this reprehensible Tom with all her heart. It was a very foolish thing for her to do. She quite agreed to that. She couldn't understand it, explain it, or help it. She only felt that she did care for him very much in spite of his faults, his indifference, and his engagement. You see, she learned to love him one summer when he made them a visit. That was before Trix caught him, and when she heard that piece of news, Polly couldn't unlove him all at once, though she tried very hard, as was her duty. That engagement was such a farce that she never had much faith in it. So she put her love away in a corner of her heart and tried to forget it, hoping it would either die or have a right to live. It didn't make her very miserable because patience, work, and common sense lent her a hand, and hope would keep popping up its bright face from the bottom of her Pandora box of troubles. Now and then, when anyone said Trix wouldn't jilt Tom, or that Tom did care for Trix more than he should, Polly had a pang, P-A-N-G, and thought she couldn't possibly bear it, but she always found she could, and so came to the conclusion that it was a merciful provision of nature that girls' hearts could stand so much and their appetites continue good when unrequited love was starving. Now she could not help yearning over this faulty, well-beloved scapegrace Tom, or help thinking with a little thrill of hope, if Trix only cared for his money, she may cast him off now he's lost it. But I'll love him all the better because he's poor. With this feeling warm at her heart, I don't wonder that Polly's hand had a soothing effect, and that after a heave or two Tom's shoulders were quiet, and certain smothered sniffs suggested that he would be all right again, and he could only wipe his eyes without anyone seeing him do it. Polly seemed to divine his wish, and tucking a little clean handkerchief into one of his half-open hands, she said, "I'm going to your father now," and with a farewell smooth, so comforting that Tom wished she'd do it again, she went away. As she paused a minute in the hall to steady herself, Maud called her from above, and thinking that the women might need her more than the men, she ran up to find Fanny waiting for her in her own room. "Mama's asleep, quite worn out, poor dear, so we can talk in here without troubling her," said Fanny, receiving her friend so quietly that Polly was amazed. "Let me come too. I won't make any fuss. It's so dreadful to be shut out everywhere and have people crying and talking and locked up, and and I not know what it means?" said Maud beseechingly. "You do know now. I've told her, Polly," said Fan as she sat down together. Told her, Polly. Yes, sat down together. And Maud perched herself on the bed so that she might retire among the pillows if her feelings were too much for her. "I'm glad you take it so well, dear. I was afraid it might upset you," said Polly, seeing now that in spite of her quiet manner, Fan's eyes had an excited look and her cheeks a feverish color. "I shall groan and moan by and by, but I dare say, but at first it sort of dazed me, and now it begins to excite me. I ought to be full of sorrow for poor Papa, and I'm truly sorry, but wicked as it may seem, it's a fact, Polly, that I'm half glad it's happened, for it takes me out of myself and gives me something to do." Fanny's eyes fell and her color rose as she spoke, but Polly understood why she wanted to forget herself and put her arm round her with a more tender sympathy than Fanny guessed. "Perhaps things are not as bad as they seem. I don't know much about such matters, but I've seen people who have failed, and they seem just as comfortable as before," said Polly. "It won't be so with us, for Papa means to give up everything and not have a word said against him. Mama's little property is settled upon her and hasn't been risked. That touched her so much. She dreads poverty even more than I do, but she begged him to take it if it would help. That pleased him, but he said nothing would induce him to do it, for it wouldn't help much and was hardly enough to keep her comfortable." "Do you know what he means to do?" asked Polly anxiously. "He said his plans were not made, but he meant to go into the little house that belonged to Grandma as soon as he could, for it wasn't honest for a bankrupt to keep up an establishment like this. I shan't mind that at all. I like the little house 'cause it's got a garden and there's a cunning room with a three-cornered closet in it that I always wanted. If that's all, I don't think bankrupting is so very bad," said Maud, taking a cheerful view of things. "I'll just wait till the carriage goes and the nice clothes and the servants, and we have to scratch along as we can. You'll change your mind then, poor child," said Fanny, whose ideas of failure were decidedly tragical. "Will they take all my things away?" cried Maud in dismay. "I dare say I don't know what we are allowed to keep, but not much, I fancy." And Fan looked as if strung up to sacrifice everything she possessed. "They shan't have my new earrings. I'll hide 'em in my best dress and my gold smelling bottle. Oh, I think it's mean to take a little girl's things away," and Maud dived among the pillows to smother a wail of anguish at the prospect of being bereft of her treasures. Polly soon lured her out again by assurances that she wouldn't be utterly despoiled, and promises to try and soften the hard hearts of her father's creditors if the earrings and the smelling bottles were attached. "I wonder if we shall be able to keep one servant just till we learn how to do the work," said Fanny, looking at her white hands with a sigh. But Maud clapped hers and gave a joyful bounce as she cried, "Now I can learn to cook. I love so to beat eggs. I'll have an apron with a bib to it like Polly's, and a feather duster, and sweep the stairs maybe with my head tied up like Katy. Oh, what fun!" "Don't laugh at her or discourage her. Let her find comfort in bibs and dustpans if she can," whispered Polly to Fan, while Maud took a joyful header among the pillows and came up smiling and blowsy, for she loved housework and often got lectured for stolen visits to the kitchen and surreptitious sweepings and dustings when the coast was clear. Mama is so feeble, I shall have to keep house, I suppose. The book just went away. Now I gotta find where I was. Sorry. Mama's so feeble I shall have to keep house, I suppose, and you must show me how, Polly, said Fan. Good practice, ma'am, as you'll find out some day, answered Polly, laughing significantly. Fanny smiled, then grew both grave and sad. This changes everything. The old set will drop me, as we did the Mertons when their father failed, and my prospects, as we say, are quite ruined. I don't believe it. Your real friends won't drop you, and you'll find out which are the true ones. You'll find out which the true ones are now. I know one friend who will be kinder than ever. Oh, Polly, do you think so? Said Fanny's eyes. And Fanny's eyes softened with sudden tears. I know who she means, cried Maud, always eager to find out things. It's herself. Polly won't mind if we're poor, 'cause she likes beggars. Is that who you mean? Asked Fan wistfully. No, it's a much better and dearer friend than I am, said Polly, pinching Fanny's cheek as it reddened prettily under her eyes. You'll never guess, Maud, so I wouldn't try, but be planning what you will put in your cunning three-cornered closet when you get it. Having got rid of Miss Paulina Pry, as Tom called Maud, who was immediately absorbed by her cupboard, the older girls soberly discussed the sudden change which had come, and Polly was surprised to see what expected strength and sense Fanny showed. Polly was too unconscious of the change which love had made in herself to understand at first the cause of her friend's new patience and fortitude, but she rejoiced over it and felt that her prophecy would yet be fulfilled. Presently Maud emerged from her new closet, bringing a somewhat startling idea with her. Do bankrupting men, Maud liked that new word, always have fits? Mercy, no. What put that into your head, child? Cried Polly. Why, Mr. Merton did, and I was thinking perhaps Papa had got one down there, and it kind of frightened me. Mr. Merton's was a bad, disgraceful failure, and I don't wonder he had a fit. Ours isn't, and Papa won't do anything of that sort, you may be sure, said Fanny, with as proud an air as if our failure was rather an honor than otherwise. Don't you think you and Maud had better go down and see him? Asked Polly. Perhaps he wouldn't like it, and I don't know what to say either, began Fan, but Polly said eagerly, I know he would like it. Never mind what you say, just go and show him that you don't doubt or blame him for this, but love him all the more, and are ready and glad to help him bear the trouble. I'm going, I ain't afraid. I'll just hug him and say, I'm ever so glad we're going to the little house, cried Maud, scrambling off the bed and running downstairs. Come with me, Polly, and tell me what to do, said Fanny, drawing her friend aside after her. You'll know what to do when you see him better than I can tell you, answered Polly, readily yielding, for she knew they considered her quite one of the family, as Tom said. At the study door they found Maud, whose courage had given out, for Mr. Merton's fit rather haunted her. Polly opened the door, and the minute Fanny saw her father, she did know what to do. The fire was low, the gas dim, and Mr. Shaw was sitting in his easy chair, his gray head in both his hands, looking lonely, old, and bowed down with care. Fanny gave Polly one look, then went over and took the gray head in both her arms, saying, with a tender quiver in her voice, "Father dear, we've come to help you bear it." Mr. Shaw looked up and seen in his daughter's face something that never had been there before, put his arm around her and leaned his tired head against hers, as if, when least expected, he had found the consolation he most needed. In that minute, Fanny loved him with mingled joy and self-reproach, what a daughter might be to her father, and Polly, thinking of feeble, selfish Mrs. Shaw asleep upstairs, saw with sudden clearness what a wife should be to her husband. A helpmate, not a burden. Touched by these unusual demonstrations, Maud crept quietly to her father's knee, whispered in a great tear shining on her little pug nose, "Papa, we don't mind it much, and I'm going to help Fan keep house for you. I'd like to do it, truly." Mr. Shaw's other arm went round the child, and for a minute no one said anything, for Polly had slipped behind his chair with that nothing should disturb the three, who were learning from misfortune how much they loved one another. Presently Mr. Shaw steadied himself and asked, "Where's my other daughter? Where's my Polly?" She was there at once, gave him one of the quiet kisses that had more than usual tenderness in it, for she loved to hear him say, "My other daughter," and then she whispered, "Don't you want Tom too?" "Of course I do. Where is the poor fellow?" "I'll bring him," and Polly departed with a most obliging alacrity. But in the hall she paused a minute to peep into the glass and see if she was all right, for somehow she was more anxious to look neat and pretty to Tom in his hour of trouble than she had ever been in his prosperous days. In lifting her arms to perk up the bow at her throat, she knocked a hat off the bracket. Now a shiny black beaver is not an object exactly calculated to inspire tender or romantic sentiments, one would fancy, but that particular stovepipe seemed to touch Polly to the heart, for she caught it up as if its fall suggested a greater one, smoothed out a slight dent, as if it was symbolical of the hard knocks its owner's head was now in danger of receiving, and stood looking at it with as much pity and respect as if it had been the crown of a disinherited prince. Girls will do such foolish things, and though we laugh at them, I think we like them the better for it, after all. Richard was himself again when Polly entered, for the handkerchief had disappeared. His head was erect, his face was steady, and his whole air had a dogged composure which seemed to say to fate, "Hit away, I'm ready." He did not hear Polly come in, for he was looking fixedly at the fire with eyes that evidently saw a very different future from that which it used to show him. But when he said, "Tom, dear, your father wants you," he got up at once, held out his hand to her, saying, "Come too, we can't get on without you," and took her back into the study with him. Then they had a long talk, for the family troubles seemed to warm and strengthen the family affection and confidence. And as the young people listened while Mr. Shaw told him told them as much of his business perplexities as they could understand. Every one of them blamed him or herself for going on so gaily and blindly while the storm was gathering, and the poor man was left to meet it all alone. Now, however, the thunderclap had come, and after the first alarm, finding they were not killed, they began to discover a certain half-anxious, half-pleasant excitement in talking it over, encouraging one another and feeling unusually friendly, as people do when a sudden shower drives two or three to the shelter of one umbrella. It was a sober talk, but not all sad, for Mr. Shaw felt inexpressibly comforted by his children's unexpected sympathy, and they tried to take the downfall cheerfully for his sake, found it easy to bear themselves. They even laughed occasionally, for the girls in their ignorance asked queer questions. Tom made ludicrously unbusinesslike propositions, and Maud gave them one hearty peal that did a world of good by pensively remarking, when the plans of the future had been explained to her, "I'm so relieved, for when Papa said we must give up everything, and Mom called us all beggars, I did think I'd got to go round asking for cold victuals with a big basket and an old shawl over my head." Oh, mercy. Old shawl over my head. Where'd it go? I said once I'd like that, but I'm afraid I shouldn't, for I can't bear Indian cake and cold potatoes. That's what poor children always seem to get, and I should hate to have Grace and the rest see me scuffing round the back gates. My little girl shall never come to that, if I can help it, said Mr. Shaw, holding her close, with a look that made Maud add, as she laid her cheek against his own, "But I'd do it, Father, if you asked me to, for I truly want to help." "So do I," cried Fanny, wondering at the same minute how it would seem to wear turned silks and clean her gloves. Tom said nothing, but drew toward him a paper of figures which his father had drawn up, and speedily reduced himself to the verge of distraction by trying to understand them, in his ardent desire to prove his willingness to put his shoulder to the wheel. "We shall pull through, children, so don't borrow trouble, only be ready for discomforts and annoyances. Put your pride in your pockets, and remember, poverty isn't disgraceful, but dishonesty is." Polly had always loved kind Mr. Shaw, but now she respected him heartily, and felt that she had not done him justice. And she sometimes thought he only cared for making money. "I shouldn't wonder if this was a good thing for the whole family, though it don't look so. Mrs. Shaw will take it the hardest, but it may stir her up so she'll forget her nerves. Be as a busy, happy mother. Forget her nerves to be as busy and happy as mother is," said Polly to herself in a hopeful mood, for poverty was an old friend, and she had learned long ago not to fear it, but to take its bitter and its sweet, and make the best of both. When they parted for the night, Polly slipped away first to leave them free, yet couldn't help lingering outside to see how tenderly the girls parted from their father. Tom hadn't a word to say for himself, for men don't kiss, caress, or cry when they feel most, and all he could do to express his sympathy and penitence was to wring his father's hand with the face full of respect, regret, and affection, and then bolt upstairs as if the Furies were after him, as they were in a mild and modern form. That's all! Woohoo! So tomorrow, hopefully, we will be reading chapter 16, called A Dress Parade. Y'all have a lovely night, and I will see y'all in the YT streets, and then live at 5 tomorrow. Love you bunches. Sleep well. Bye-bye.